Hello and welcome to the first episode of Right Down the Rabbit Hole, where we discuss concepts, places, history, and maybe a little whimsy. This first episode is about gerrymandering. We are coming up on the 10-year redistricting cycle that happens after every census. And we had a pretty tumultuous last 10 years, mostly due to heavily Republican gerrymandering. We had state legislatures and the U.S. Congress that were unrepresentative of the people in the country and in each state. So we'll get into those kind of things here in the first episode, and here we go. So every 10 years, after the census numbers are released, each state, county, city, and school district goes through a process called redistricting. This process divvies up electoral districts within each state, county, city, and school district, and what those boundaries will look like for the next 10 years. It's supposed to be a process to make things fair and representative of the people who live within them, but it often ends up being a tool for oppression and disenfranchisement, silencing the very voices they're supposed to represent. It's been bad in the past, but it's gotten much worse over the last 10 years. The reason? Gerrymandering. So what is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is a verb to manipulate the boundaries of an electoral district so as to favor one party or class. Basically, gerrymandering is cheating. One party giving itself an unfair advantage to keep or strengthen their power. It disenfranchises voters, very often younger voters and voters of color, so that one party benefits. But what it really does is it makes it so that the majority does not rule, as it should in a democracy, or even have a chance at being in power. It's a complicated subject with a complex explanation, but that's the point, to make it so complicated and so complex that people just shrug their shoulders and give up, because it's a lot to wrap your brain around. And it is a lot to wrap your brain around. But I think we can unravel the mysteries of gerrymandering. What it looks like, who does it, and some ways we can possibly get out of this maze of a mess of gerrymandering. So with that, let's go right down the rabbit hole. So we know gerrymandering is bad, but what exactly is it? And how do we know what it looks like? The answer isn't always easy, but first, let's talk about what an electoral district should look like, some legal guidelines, if you will. Whenever a state legislature or redistricting commission is tasked with redistricting, there are certain criteria that must be followed to make districts fair, consistent, and representative of the populations within them. Federal law and the Constitution lays out this criteria succinctly. Districts must be equal in population and not intentionally or inadvertently discriminate on the basis of race. That's it. Not a lot to go off of, and there's a lot of room for interpretation. So most states have their own criteria as well. We'll call them the 4 C's. Compactness, making sure that the minimum amount of distance between all parts of the district, the ideal being like a circle or a hexagon. Contiguity, all parts being connected, not having separate parts here and there. County and city preservation. Now this is an important one. Preserving a county and not splitting it up in as many electoral districts or minimizing the number of districts that it's split up within is key. And cities are the next level of subdivision for that. And then finally, competitiveness, favored over partisanship. So we're avoiding safe districts. We're not drawing districts just to make one party or one person safe. So what does this look like in practice? Well, here's a great visual on gerrymandering. You can see here that this entity, we'll say it's a state, is a heavily Democratic state. let's say 60-40, with 5 congressional districts. If the state is controlled by Democrats, they might just decide to draw themselves 5 districts and not give Republicans any say or voice. Easy peasy. But let's say somehow, in this blue state, Republicans take control of the legislature and governor's office, and then they decide to gerrymander themselves a majority of the districts by packing as many Democrats as possible into 1 or 2 districts, and then, with less Democrats to go around for the rest of the districts, draw themselves a majority of the other districts, thereby securing their majority in the state's legislature or congressional delegation, even though they don't have a majority in the state. So how can we trust that state legislatures, made up of partisan individuals and usually controlled by one party or another, will draw districts that don't protect themselves and their party? We really can't, and honestly, I don't think we should. The manner in which an electoral district is drawn varies by state. In some states, the legislature draws the districts and the governor has no power. If they can't agree, it goes to court. In others, like Connecticut and North Carolina, the governor does not have veto power, so it's up to the courts to decide if someone sues or not. In 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that federal courts cannot rule on cases of political gerrymandering. State Supreme Courts may still have a say, but who's voting in state judicial elections? You should be. In other states, there's something called a Redistricting Commission. Sometimes the commission is politically appointed, sometimes it's made up of an equal number of citizens from each party. The commissions are tasked with drawing districts following the rules: non-discrimination, equality, and the 4 C's, among other things. The point is, the way we draw districts in the U.S. varies by state, and there's really no firm check on the legislative branch in this case. You could say it's all over the map. So what does gerrymandering look like? What does a more fairly drawn district look like? Let's take a look at 2 opposite sides of the same coin of district boundaries here. First, let's start with my hometown, Sacramento, California Congressional District 6. So we know that California has an independent redistricting commission made up of an equal number of citizens representing the political parties in California. We can see here that this district follows all of the guidelines of a fair district. Its boundaries are very closely associated with the city of Sacramento, West Sacramento, and a few inner suburbs. You can see here that its neighboring district, California Congressional District 7, incorporates the vast majority of the rest of Sacramento County, and importantly, the vast majority of the populated areas of Sacramento County. Seems simple enough to draw districts that are fair, contiguous, and follow the boundaries of the cities and counties that they incorporate. But let's look at what a partisan drawn district looks like. This is Maryland Congressional District 3. This district has been gerrymandered so grossly that it encompasses parts of 3 different urban areas: Annapolis, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore. Now, technically, these are all in the same metropolitan area, D.C., Baltimore, and so it technically meets the criteria, except it doesn't. Now, Maryland is a very democratic state, so sometimes, like in this case, partisan gerrymandering like this is done to save one representative's district and make it safe for them. Sometimes it's done to bump up the numbers for one party, who may already be the dominant party in that state, by just 1 or 2 seats. This is the case in Illinois, another heavily Democratic state, or Alabama, a heavily Republican state. Sometimes gerrymandering is more subtle. Sometimes the experts draw up districts down to the street level that use census data to pack voters from one party or another in, so that there are less of them to go around for remaining districts. This results in elections where only one party runs in elections because there are so many voters of one party in that district that it's not worth it for other parties to run. Let's take the example of Wisconsin's 4th Congressional District here. On first glance, this looks okay. Contiguous, doesn't discriminate, preserves the city of Milwaukee in one district, and is fairly representative of the city's liberal politics. But diving deeper, down the rabbit hole, if you will, we see that half of the city of Wauwatosa and Greenfield and the city of West Dallas all inner ring suburbs of Milwaukee, are in completely different districts. These cities are closely tied to Milwaukee, and yet they're in a district with far out Oconomowoc and West Bend, both very conservative cities. Now, the southern part of Milwaukee is in Wisconsin's 1st District, and the city of River Hills in northern Milwaukee County is in Wisconsin's 6th Congressional District. So, Milwaukee County, a relatively compact, densely populated county of about 950,000 people, has been carved up into 4 different congressional districts. On the surface, it seems okay, compact and contiguous. But the carving up of counties in as many districts as possible for the benefit of one party, in this case, the Republican Party, is pretty extreme. Let's go back and compare with the aforementioned Sacramento County districts, and we can easily see where the contrast is most stark. In Sacramento County, a county of almost 1.5 million people, much larger than Milwaukee County, the vast majority of the population is split up over 2 congressional districts. See the difference now? When you get down to the smaller legislative districts, the results are far more damaging to democracy, and in this case, Democratic voters in the state. Back in 2011, when the Republican majority Wisconsin state legislature was drawing the districts, specifically the state legislative districts, they asked state legislators, including former U.S. Senate candidate Leah Buckmer, where they would like for their district boundaries to be. They asked them, what streets do you want to include? What streets do you not want to include? We think you should include these streets. We think you shouldn't include these streets. The reason they did so is because they were wanting to gerrymander those districts to make them safe for the legislators in their party. Now, in the 2020 election, the Democratic Party received 46% of the vote in Wisconsin assembly races, but only won 38% of the assembly seats. When you factor in safe seats when there's only one person running, which overall can drum up big numbers for Republicans and mostly shut out vote totals for Democrats, in an election where Republicans garnered 8% more votes on a gerrymandered map, they now have a 61-seat majority. Pretty perverse if you think about it. And sadly, it's been worse. So in 2018, Democrats swept all statewide races in Wisconsin. In this blue wave election, they won 54% of the votes cast in Wisconsin assembly races. However, because of gerrymandering, they only won 36% of the seats in the Wisconsin assembly. So in an election where Democrats won a clear majority in statewide races and should have easily taken back the state legislature, the Republican gerrymander kept Republicans in power with an almost 2/3 majority. The Republican gerrymander in Wisconsin is widely considered to be one of the most effective gerrymanders of all time. So, the Wisconsin Republican Party is really good at cheating, and they don't care who knows it. It's infuriating. It's also undemocratic and just plain immoral. Something you'd think you'd see in Soviet Russia, not the United States. And it's bad whoever does it. Now also consider the insidiousness of Republican efforts at voter suppression, voter ID laws, address matching, signature matching, and more. And the burden on Democrats, not just in Wisconsin, but in almost every Republican state, which by the way, Wisconsin is not, becomes almost too heavy a burden to bear. It becomes minority rule and is far outside the boundaries of a healthy, functioning democracy. So, we know what gerrymandering is now and how it looks at the extremes. But what can be done about this horrifying affront to our democracy? Can something be done about it? I believe so. One of the people doing something about it is former Attorney General Eric Holder. Now, Eric Holder founded and heads up an organization called the National Democratic Redistricting Commission that aims to make conditions more favorable for Democrats through the next redistricting process. Now, you may say to yourself, sounds like maybe gerrymandering in and of itself, or some type of advantage to Democrats, right? But we're talking about a situation where Republicans have such a heavy advantage that giving Democrats more of a competitive edge in elections only makes things a little bit more fair. And still, advantage Republicans. So the organization does work on behalf of Democrats, but it also works in the interest of fairness for all. Take Michigan and Ohio, for example, two heavily gerrymandered states. They helped pass initiatives that will bring more fairness to the ballot and, yes, make things more fair for Democrats, but again, it really only tips the scale further towards fairness for all because things have not been fair at all for Democrats and residents in those Democratic areas since the last redistricting cycle. Now, another thing that can be done is the passing of legislation by Congress that levels the playing field for everyone across the board. No more Republican gerrymandering, no more Democratic gerrymandering. Fair maps for everyone so that our government is truly more representative of the people in this country. Redistricting reform, a new Voting Rights Act, and minimizing and eliminating partisan gerrymandering is one way we can work toward a more perfect union. Now, if only we could deal with that ultimate gerrymander, the Electoral College. If you like this episode, hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. See you next time, right down the rabbit hole.